If you are like me and you have trouble with queen and pawn versus queen and pawn endgames, this video is for you. So the one thing to note with queen and pawn endgames is basically if there is a side with a passed pawn, that side is usually going to win. The reason being because a queen and a pawn combination just by themselves are so powerful that a single queen cannot stop them. And this usually goes when you have a knight versus knight or a bishop versus bishop or a rook versus rook endgame, but that usually takes a little bit more time to maneuver the pawn and the piece up the board. But you'll see here in this first example that having a queen and pawn just tandem here in the endgame is such a powerful force and can really queen itself very quickly. So we have in this position, white has passed pawn over here on a2 looking to queen. And black has the 4 pawns here. King's out of the action. Queen's the only thing defending this pass from pawn from queening. And this is how white pushes that queen forward. So he does that by pushing a4. And the queen immediately blockades the pawn, trying to prevent any further advancement from that pawn. And when you have a queen on the board, all you have to do is come over here to b5 and say, hey, let's trade. And if we trade, the king is outside of the square, so there's no way that the king can stop the pawn in time. Because of this, black has to retreat its queen to another blockading square here on a7. And you just push the pawn up. Black moves its king over here to h7. And white just continues to push the pawn. There's nothing to really stop this pawn from advancing. The queen cannot stop it by itself, as we saw in that blockading example just a few moves ago. And after going g5, there isn't a lot black can do in this position. And white just does the blockade here. Black moves out of the way, and you just keep pushing that pawn. And with that, white's queen is going to push in the next move. So now you see in these queen and pawn endgames how important it is to push your passed pawns. Let's look at another example where you have a passed pawn, but the king isn't in its safe position, and it's out in the side of the board. So we have here in this position, the white king aggressively placed here on the middle of the board. Black has its passed pawn looking to promote here to the a1 square. Black is just looking to push this pawn forward. So how is black going to do that? Now, in these kind of end games where both sides have passed pawn, it's really about who has the furthest advanced passed pawn in this position. They'll usually have the advantage in the end game. So with that in mind, it might be worth sacrificing a pawn or two to get you that advanced pawn that gives you that slight edge in this end game if you both have passed pawns in these queen and pawn end games. The other thing that you want to know is your opponent's best defense, if you have the more further advanced pawn, is a perpetual check to get a draw. So you got to make sure that you're advancing that pawn while also simultaneously preventing any perpetual checks that could draw the game and prevent you from winning the game. So now with this position, black has the passed pawn, and the best way of moving forward here is to go queen to f8. The reason being going queen to f8 is to prevent queen to d8 check. And then after the king moves, going king to f7 with mating chances. So your first thing to do in this position is to stop that mating threat. And you might be thinking, oh, this pawn right here is completely undefended. You're gonna just lose it. But that's not the case here because there is a little bit of a trap. And white sees it in this position by going king to g5. Now, if you didn't go king to g5, and let's say the queen takes this a4 pawn, you have queen to d6 check. The king comes over here to f5. And after the king comes over here to g7, there's really no way to stop him. It's mate in 2. The queen goes to check the king. You just push f7 check. And with the queen taking, you have mate there. So while the pawn wasn't directly defended, it was indirectly defended there. So after the king comes over here to g5, black's king comes over here to e7, checking this king, and also moving this queen to a little bit more active square where it's looking at more pieces of the board rather than here at f8. After king to f4, he pushes the pawn here to a3. It is supported by this queen, and that is black's whole plan here, is to push this a pawn as safely as possible. So black tries to stop it by going king to e3, trying to get its king over here to the queen side as quick as possible. It's a slow moving piece, so it needs to get mobilized first. If you decided not to move the king here and you went queen to a4 trying to stop this advancement, you have queen to c5 here, and the king probably won't be able to reach the queen side in time, and you'll be able to easily advance this pawn. So after king to e3, trying to get its king to the king side, queen to b7 here, looking to get to b3 or b2 to try to advance this pawn. The queen throws a check, but this is really just part of the maneuver to get its queen over here to a5 to attack this pawn. So the king comes over here to h7 to limit the scopes of any more checks available to the white queen. So after coming to a5, black comes over here to b2, just easily pushing this queen forward. And white uses the only defensive resource it has by coming over here to c7, looking to take this pawn here on f7, create the perpetual check that black is trying to avoid. So the queen comes over here to b3 to defend this threat and also continue escorting this pawn. White comes over here to g4, just trying to open up these kingside pawns so that we can get more checks and get that perpetual check. That's white's best chances of getting the draw here. And black decides, nah, I'm not even going to fall for it. I'm just going to go and queen this pawn. So white goes ahead for a5 one more time to prevent this pawn from queening. Just at least another move. And black moves over here to b2 to escort the pawn. And white comes over here to c7 again, looking to check and take this pawn. So it looks like you're in a back and forth here in this position. So black's only position here is going king to g8 here. And so the reason he's doing this is to allow a check so that he can maneuver and get this queen to a worse square, because there's three things that this white queen is doing here. The first thing is it's one, looking at this f7 pawn. Two, it is looking at this c3 and protecting this from black taking and getting a check themselves. But the most important thing that I didn't realize when I was first looking at this example is the queen coming back to the 7th rank here to protect this threat and this king. So after the queen checks here on d8, the king comes back over here on g7, and now the queen is on d4, and it can't easily get back to the 7th rank without dropping the c3 pawn. So the king comes over here to h7, and now that this queen can't return to c7, you see the problems here as he goes to attack this e7 pawn. So he's defending the c3 pawn and attacking this f7 pawn, but the 7th rank is wide open. So the queen throws the check here on e3, which is a maneuvering move, because after the king moves here on e2, the queen comes over here to a7, guarding this and defending the escorted pawn over here at a2. So after the g5 takes, trying to open up the lines, the queen just queens here on a1. And after taking there, the pawn takes on f6, and white resigns here. So to reiterate, the plan when you're in a queen and pawn endgame is to take your passed pawn if you have the most advanced passed pawn, protect it, and get it pushed to the queening square as quickly as possible. And if you're on the defense, you're looking to get perpetual checks and get the draw. So what if you don't have any passed pawns though, and you're in this queen and pawn endgame? The cool thing about the queen is it's a very powerful checkmating force if you know how to use it correctly. So you have here in this position, black is up a pawn, but they are all on the same side of the board. So it's going to be hard to push these pawns up the board with these queens defending the position. So black's plan is simple from here on out. With the queen guarding this c7 pawn, black is just going to bring his king down the board and try to get to f1 and get the checkmating here. So all you need is a king and a queen to get a checkmate for the most part. So in this position, with black to move, he comes out king to f6, and he's going aggressive, trying to get down to this f1 squared. That's his goal. So white's goal here, if you're on the defense and you're down material, you're going for the perpetual checks as much as possible, see if you can get a draw out of this. So white starts with the perpetual check here on d8, and the king just starts marching down the board. And after getting to e7 here, white's just going to keep checking until black can prove that there are no other checks that white can give. So he continues to move forward. He comes over here to d3. And after the queen comes over here to d7, he just moves the king to e2. And he's looking at this f1 square, and it's getting pretty dangerous for white. After queen to e7, the queen comes over here, blocking the check from the queen because it's supported by this pawn. So now that it's eliminated any checks from white, there's nowhere that he can go to get a check. So he comes to queen to b7, trying to position itself to start checking again. And black moves forward with f5 here, looking to create a little outpost here for the queen here on e4 potentially. And this position will help eliminate any more checks that white might have later on. So white comes over here to g2, throwing the check. And one thing to note, that when you're checking from close range like this, you're not going to have a lot of threats depending on where your opponent moves. Whereas when you're in a long range and you have an open board, you can checkmate all over the board. But here it's really not many checks that you can go from here after this, right? So after the king comes over here to e3, there's not really a great checking square to go other than here to g1. So white moves over here to b2, looking to get any more checks, and black just continues to centralize his queen and controlling a lot of the checking squares. So he can't check here, can't check here, can't check here. So the only checking squares here on a3, which is what he goes with, and the queen blocks here on d3. So the king and the queen are slowly making their way towards this white king, and then white's really having a hard time stopping it. Goes queen to c5, and the king to f3, moving ever so closer to this king. Queen to c6, queen to e4, queen to c3 check, king to f2. And now you're just in a very dangerous territory, because after the c5 check, the queen comes over here to e3, blocking while setting up a mating net of their own, looking at g3 for mate after going g1. So queen to c2 here, you block again, and this is now a little trap that you can set that if there's any more checks, you can move the king, and you're going to have discovered check that's going to lead to a mate. So white comes over here to c6, preventing king to f3 here, but it doesn't matter because king to f1, the king comes over here, and then instead of throwing the check over here on g4, king just moves over here to g1, threatening queen to h2 checkmate. White does the only thing it can, going c5 here. Black just blocks, looking to checkmate in the next move, And after coming to e3, it's the last defensive resource for white to get at the draw. If you do take here, it's a draw. The king can't move to any of these 3 squares, and it's a draw. So here, white does the only thing is he attacks that queen, and that queen has nowhere to go. Ends up taking the queen, taking, and after taking there, this king has nowhere to go. Black's going to easily win this endgame and win the game. So that's how you win an endgame with queen and multiple pawns on the board. Just to reiterate, if you have passed pawns, you're the most advanced of the passed pawn, make sure you just push that passed pawn as quickly as possible and as safely as possible to prevent any drawing chances by your opponent. And if they're all on the same side of the board, you can use that king and really just bully your way and checkmate the king there. So if you like that video, please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Our next video will be the queen versus 2 rooks endgame. That video will be here, and we'll see you next time.